Okay, so it is a Tuesday morning in 1943. And I want you to imagine walking into a federal public works office in, say, a mid-sized American city.
Right, just a standard regional office.
Exactly. And the very first thing that hits you when you open the door is just this absolute ringing silence.
Which is weird for a government office, you know.
It's eerie because you look in the corner and the drafting tables are entirely bare. I mean, no blueprints, no tracing paper, no T-squares.
Just stripped clean.
Yeah, and the time clock's bolted to the wall,
Mm-hmm.
completely stilled. You walk past the desk of the certifying officer.
Oh, the person who had to actually approve the relief applications.
Right, the person whose entire job for the last 8 years was to sit across from desperate families, audit their meager finances, and, stamp them as officially in need.
Which gave them access to a federal paycheck.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But that chair is just totally empty. You move back toward the foreman's area, where all the local road paving and sewer trenching logistics were usually, violently haggled over.
So stand-in.
Completely abandoned. Over by the window, there's a typewriter assigned to a researcher who is compiling local folklore for the state guidebooks. It just sits there under a dust cover. Okay, let's unpack this, because a program that employed 8.5 million Americans didn't just run out of money. It ran out of unemployed people.
Yeah, and the visual of that ghost tower office, it perfectly encapsulates one of the strangest economic transitions in American history.
It really does.
Because when we study massive government employment initiatives, our modern cynicism kind of trains us to look for a catastrophic failure.
Well, always. We're waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. We expect to find the exact moment the funding was slashed by a hostile Congress or, I don't know, a corruption scandal that forced the doors shut.
Leaving all these desperate people clutching voided paychecks, yeah.
Right. But the Work Projects Administration, the WPA, it experienced the exact inverse of a tragedy.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is, because for 8 agonizing years, the fundamental nightmare of this agency was the waiting list.
Always the waiting list.
Right. I mean, the most terrifying reality for a WPA administrator wasn't finding work for people to do. It was looking out the window at a line of destitute citizens stretching around the block.
And just knowing the federal appropriation could only cover a fraction of them?
Exactly.
That structural reality is just crucial to understand. There was always infinitely more suffering than there was funding.
Yeah, without a doubt.
But in this 1943 office we're picturing, the workers weren't forced out onto the street. They were magnetically pulled away.
Drawn into the war effort.
Yes. They were drawn to the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, riveting the hulls of Liberty ships. They were absorbed by the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan.
And obviously, millions of them were just swept up by the Selective Service Draft.
Right, shipped to the front lines of a two-front global war. I mean, the war effectively hired everyone the WPA had been built to save.
It really did.
A Leviathan, constructed entirely to fight the existential crisis of unemployment, was put out of business by the sudden, violent disappearance of the unemployed.
It is a textbook case of death by success.
Death by success, yeah. I like that phrasing.
The underlying pathology the agency was created to manage it simply ceased to exist in the domestic labor market.
And that paradox forms the core mission of this deep dive today. We are going to examine the really granular mechanics of how the largest peacetime employer in American history was systematically dismantled at the exact moment its primary problem vanished.
Because we have to look at this objectively.
Right. We are going to conduct a ruthless ledger closing. As we like to say, this is an accounting, not a eulogy.
We have to grade the WPA against its 3 foundational objectives, right? Relief, recovery, and infrastructure and culture.
Exactly. So to really understand how those 8.5 million workers were just absorbed, we have to look closely at the tectonic economic shift that emptied that room.
The contrast is just jarring.
It is. Because the very thing the WPA failed to achieve in 8 years of grinding, exhaustive domestic policy, which was full employment war mobilization, just accomplished in roughly 24 months.
Yeah, it's incredible when you look at the timeline from 1940 through 1942. You see a complete inversion of the labor market.
Because when Franklin Roosevelt took office, unemployment hovered around a staggering 25%.
Which is just a catastrophic number.
Right. And even deep into the late 1930s, despite all the alphabet agencies, the private sector simply refused to absorb the surplus labor.
Well, the mechanism behind that sudden shift requires looking at how the federal government fundamentally altered its approach to spending.
Okay, walk us through that. What changed?
Well, in the 1930s, private industry was highly hesitant to invest capital. There was a deep lack of confidence, often referred to at the time as a capital strike.
But basically, businesses were hoarding cash because they were terrified of the economy.
Exactly. But as 1940 ticked into 1941, the drumbeat of war in Europe grew deafening. The United States began its transformation into the arsenal of democracy.
Right.
And the federal government, through entities that would eventually become the War Production Board, they didn't just ask private industry to ramp up. They command-directed the economy.
Which is a huge difference.
Massive. They offered what were called cost-plus contracts.
Right, I've seen that term. That means guaranteeing corporations a profit regardless of their production expenses, right?
Exactly. It entirely removed the financial risk for private enterprise, which unleashed a voracious demand for labor.
And that voracious demand completely shattered the careful economic balancing act the WPA had maintained for years regarding wages.
Yeah, the WPA was in a tough spot with wages.
I always think of the WPA's compensation structure as a pressure valve on a massive industrial boiler.
That's a good way to put it.
Because they paid what was called a security wage. The goal was to vent just enough steam, meaning distribute just enough cash so society didn't explode from mass starvation or like a radical revolution.
Right. Keep people alive, keep the peace.
But they deliberately kept the valve tight. They paid below the prevailing private sector rate because they were terrified of draining the private labor engine.
If the WTA paid top dollar, no one would ever go back to a private farm or a textile mill.
Exactly. The security wage was a lifeline, but it was designed to be slightly uncomfortable.
Which is a brilliant analogy because the moment the defense plants opened their doors, they weren't offering a security wage.
No, they were not.
They were offering competitive, aggressive wages. They offered overtime. They offered the kind of income that allowed a family to build a savings account, buy war bonds, and genuinely thrive, rather than just perpetually staving off destitution.
So the WPA worker didn't have to be evicted from the program.
Not at all. The economic gravity of the defense industry simply overpowered the modest pull of the relief check. The rolls plummeted organically.
But, this organic drain introduces a massive political tension that I really wanted to dissect here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the WPA rolls plummeted naturally because people just went to get better jobs, doesn't that effectively validate the program's fiercest conservative critics?
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Because if we look at the congressional record from 1935 onward, the anti-New Deal coalition had a remarkably consistent talking point. The emergency is over.
They argued that relentlessly.
They did. They said the crisis had passed, that private enterprise could handle the recovery if the government would just get out of the way, and that the WPA was merely a bloated political machine designed to buy votes for the Democratic Party.
Right, the classic critique.
So if the workers all just got up and left, didn't those critics essentially win the argument?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the critics didn't suddenly win this ideological debate. The resolution of that political tension is incredibly nuanced.
How so?
The critics never managed to pass a sweeping, definitive piece of legislation that dismantled the WPA based on the sheer force of their free market rhetoric.
They didn't legislate it out of existence.
Exactly. What actually occurred was that the macroeconomic facts on the ground violently shifted to match their premise.
Okay, right.
The emergency of unemployment truly was over, but it was not resolved by a return to normal, laissez-faire, peacetime capitalism. It was resolved by a massive, state-directed, deficit-financed war mobilization.
Right, and I have to challenge the historical framing that either side gets to claim a pure victory here.
Yeah, it's muddy.
Because if we're impartially assessing the political reality, the WPA didn't benevolently dissolve itself out of a sense of mission accomplished.
No, bureaucrats rarely give up power voluntarily.
Exactly. Had the Depression lingered, the agency would have fought for its appropriations indefinitely. But conversely, the right-wing coalition didn't kill it with a legislative stake through the heart either.
The war economy simply superseded the entire debate.
It rendered the foundational premise of a work relief program entirely moot. You just cannot operate a jobs program for the unemployed in an economy operating at 110% capacity with a massive labor shortage.
Which forced the Roosevelt administration into a highly unusual administrative corner.
Yeah, what do you do with the bureaucracy?
Right. You have a sprawling federal bureaucracy spanning every county in America. The workers are leaving. The mandate is evaporating, but you cannot simply let an agency of that magnitude ghost the American public.
You can't just walk away and leave the lights on.
Exactly. A formal dissolution is required. The administration had to legally and rhetorically close the doors.
Which brings us to a really specific piece of paper dated December 4th, 1942.
Yes, a very important document.
Let's dig into that document. It is a letter from President Roosevelt directed to the Federal Works Administrator.
And just for a bit of bureaucratic context here, the Federal Works Agency was the umbrella department that absorbed the WPA in 1939.
Right, at which point the Works Progress Administration was subtly renamed the Work Projects Administration.
A slight rebranding.
Yeah, a minor tweak. But in this letter, FDR officially directs that the WPA be discontinued.
But the language he uses is fascinating.
Oh, here's where it gets really interesting. The exact language he chooses is just a masterclass in political legacy management. He wrote that the WPA, quote, has asked for and earned an honorable discharge.
Framing the closure as an honorable discharge is a profoundly calculated rhetorical maneuver.
It's extremely deliberate.
By deploying explicit military terminology for a civilian public works program, Roosevelt was attempting to dictate how history would record the agency's death.
He wasn't shutting down a redundant bureaucracy. He was mustering out a decorated veteran.
Exactly, a veteran who had just returned from a long, grueling, but ultimately victorious domestic campaign.
And he reinforced that in the very next sentence, stating the closure was done, quote, with the satisfaction of a good job well done and with a high sense of integrity.
Integrity being the key word there.
Yeah, this is FDR's preemptive strike against the historical record. He knew intimately what the political enemies of the WPA called it.
The favorite epithet was boondoggle.
The boondoggle, yes. Opponents painted the agency as a colossal engine of waste, characterized by men leaning on shovels, raking leaves back and forth, and executing make-work projects devoid of actual civic value.
Right. Roosevelt was refusing to allow the WPA to be buried under the banner of the boondoggle.
He was fiercely protecting the concept of dignity,
which was the absolute cornerstone of the entire enterprise, championed by the WPA's founding administrator, Harry Hopkins.
Right. Hopkins was obsessed with the dignity aspect.
He was. And Hopkins and his rival, Harold Ikes, had massive internal battles over how to handle relief. Ikes wanted heavy, slow, permanent infrastructure built by private contractors.
Big dams, big bridges.
Yes. But Hopkins argued that people were starving right now. Hopkins believed in the inherent psychological dignity of a paycheck over the degrading nature of a cash handout.
Or what they call the dole.
Exactly. Hopkins understood that providing a job, even if it was just sweeping a sidewalk or digging a drainage ditch, preserved a person's self-respect and kept their skills from entirely atrophying.
So Roosevelt's honorable discharge letter was really an attempt to extend that vital human dignity to the institution itself.
That's a great way to view it.
But, I take issue with accepting Roosevelt's framing at face value, though.
Fair enough. This raises an important question, right?
We have to grapple with the reality of 1942. Was this truly an honorable, triumphant exit, or was it a political defeat dressed up in graceful military rhetoric?
It's a valid critique.
Because if we look at the congressional maneuvering leading up to this, the WPA had been bleeding out politically for years.
Oh, absolutely. The historical evidence heavily supports the idea that the agency was already dying a death of 1,000 cuts.
The late 1930s were incredibly hostile to the New Deal.
They really were. In 1939, Congress passed the Hatch Act, which severely restricted the political activities of federal employees.
Which directly targeted the WPA.
Because critics viewed it as a massive Democratic turnout machine.
Right, and furthermore, you saw the outright legislative execution of the Federal Theater Project.
Ah, yes, the Dies Committee.
The Dies Committee, which was the precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. They investigated the arts projects for communist sympathies.
The political coalition that originally authorized the WPA was deeply fractured by that point, with conservative Southern Democrats aligning with Republicans.
Exactly my point. So had the defense boom not arrived, the Roosevelt administration would likely have been subjected to the slow, humiliating starvation of the program.
They would have faced progressively tighter budgets, relentless congressional subpoenas, just a highly embarrassing ideological defeat.
So in a very real sense, dying by success, dying because the workers organically left for the war effort, was a massive political reprieve.
It provided a very convenient escape hatch.
They didn't have to surrender to the conservative coalition. They simply declared victory due to shifting macroeconomic weather and went home.
And that framing allowed them to control the narrative of the closure. But, managing the narrative is entirely different from managing the physical liquidation.
Oh, right. Roosevelt's letter was merely a directive.
Executing that directive across a continental bureaucracy is a logistical nightmare.
Just imagine you are handed the job of actually executing this in 1943.
I'd probably quit.
Right. Formal liquidation is slated for June 30, 1943, and you are assigned to this newly minted, intensely unglamorous unit under the Federal Works Agency called the Division for Liquidation.
Such a bureaucratic name.
It sounds so boring.
Yeah.
Your mandate is to operate for exactly 1 year, shutting down operations entirely by June 30, 1944.
The sheer scope of the logistics is almost incomprehensible.
Walk us through it. What do they actually have to do?
Well, this wasn't just a matter of locking the doors of a few regional offices. The Division for Liquidation had to manage tens of thousands of active, deeply complex construction sites.
Because projects were mid-build.
Exactly. Consider the jurisdictional nightmare of a bridge spanning a county line that is only 40% complete when the liquidation order drops.
Who finishes it?
Right. The liquidators had to negotiate with the local sponsors, the mayors, the county commissioners, to legally transfer the liability, the architectural blueprints, and the physical materials to the municipality.
So the town could eventually finish it without federal labor.
Yes.
And beyond the legal transfers, consider the physical empire the WPA owned. The Division for Liquidation had to inventory and appraise mountains of federal property.
Mountains of it.
We were talking about thousands of cement mixers, fleets of trucks, steamrollers, miles of copper wire.
Even the typewriters and drafting tables we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. They had to value all of this and seamlessly transfer the bulk of it to the War Department.
Because the War Department was desperate for heavy equipment to build domestic military bases.
Right. And simultaneously, they had to settle an incredibly complex web of financial accounts. They had to process final payrolls, close out contracts with private material vendors,
And legally resolve thousands of outstanding workers' compensation claims for men injured on WPA job sites over the previous 8 years.
which is just a staggering amount of legal work.
And underpinning all of this physical and financial liquidation is the paperwork.
The absolute deluge of documentation.
They had to organize, catalog, and archive the employment records, the project proposals, the financial ledgers, and the engineering reports for a workforce of 8.5 million people.
I was actually digging into the National Archives data on this, and what struck me is that the very boredom of the Division for Liquidation is its greatest historical triumph.
How do you mean?
Well, when a government dismantles a multi-billion-dollar entity, the historical norm is chaos. We see it in modern geopolitical withdrawals or the privatization of state assets. It almost always ends in missing billions, rampant embezzlement, and massive public outcry.
Oh, certainly. Money just vanishes.
But the WPA experienced none of that. There were no riots by workers cheated out of their final wages.
There were no headline-grabbing scandals of liquidators selling off federal steamrollers to their brothers-in-law.
Exactly. The meticulous grinding boredom of that 1-year liquidation period is precisely why the New Deal's legacy survived intact.
The WPA essentially died quietly in a filing cabinet.
Yes, and the physical manifestation of that victory is National Archives Record Group 69.
Record Group 69, yeah.
That massive archival collection is the only reason historians can study the granular impact of the Depression.
It is the bedrock data. It allows modern organizations like the Living New Deal Project at UC Berkeley to digitally map exactly where a specific sidewalk was poured in Ohio or where a post office mural was painted in Oregon.
Because the liquidators successfully closed the largest set of books the federal government had ever maintained on a peacetime civilian workforce.
Which provides the perfect mechanism for us to open our own ledger now.
Exactly. The archives are sealed. It is time for the accounting. We are going to score the WPO against its 3 original foundational objectives.
Starting with the most immediate, relief.
Right. Did it keep people alive?
When we look at the gross numbers for relief, they are just staggering.
Give us the totals.
Over its lifespan, the WPA employed roughly 8.5 million unique individuals across an estimated 1.4 million separate projects.
And to contextualize that, the total population of the United States in the late 1930s was roughly 130 million.
So the WPA touched an immense percentage of American households directly.
We really have to translate that metric into the human reality on the ground, though. Those 8.5 million paychecks prevented the total collapse of the American working class.
They kept a generation of families from being evicted into Hooverville.
Right. They allowed fathers and mothers to feed their children through their own labor, which, going back to what we said earlier, maintained the psychological architecture of the household.
And critically, from a macroeconomic perspective, it kept the workforce from degrading.
Meaning what, exactly?
If a machinist sits idle for 5 years, he loses his edge. The WPA, by keeping people working, preserved the latent skill of the American labor pool.
Oh, so that when the war industry eventually needed them, they were capable of answering the call.
Exactly. It was the ultimate vindication of Harry Hopkins' blunt assessment. People don't eat in the long run, they eat every day.
I love that quote. The WPA approached poverty not as an abstract cycle to be broken by eventual market correction, but as an immediate biological crisis requiring intervention.
In that regard, providing a daily wage was profoundly successful.
But if we are maintaining an honest ledger here, we have to heavily qualify this.
We do. Why is this only a partial success?
We must score relief as a partial success, because the execution fundamentally failed to scale to the true size of the crisis. Let's examine the zenith of the program.
Okay.
In late 1938, the WPA hit its absolute peak employment, carrying approximately 3.3 million workers on the active payroll simultaneously.
That is a massive logistical achievement.
It is, but it was nowhere near enough.
Right. The cruel reality of the WPA was the means testing.
Yes, to get a job, you had to prove utter destitution. You had to strip your assets, face an investigator, and prove you were functionally at rock bottom.
And even if you passed that degrading test and were certified as eligible, there was no guarantee of a job.
Because Congress capped the appropriations, the WPA never possessed the capital to hire everyone who qualified.
For every individual swinging a pickaxe or laying bricks, there were eligible, starving Americans languishing on a wait list.
Denied entry simply because the quota for their county was full. So the relief was genuine and life-saving, but it was completely arbitrary.
It was a lifeboat, but the administration deliberately built a lifeboat that could only hold maybe a third of the drowning passengers at any given time.
Wow, yeah. So we record a partial success for relief. It was a triumph of localized execution, but a failure of national scale.
Which naturally forces us to the second column on our ledger, recovery.
Right. If the relief was a Band-Aid, did the WPA eventually cure the underlying macroeconomic disease?
And this is the harshest reality we have to face in this accounting.
We have to be blunt here.
The broad prevailing scholarly consensus is that the WPA and the New Deal broadly failed to achieve its ultimate goal of recovery.
It did not end the Great Depression.
It instituted vital structural reforms like the FDIC and Social Security that stabilized the system against future shocks, but it did not restore the American economy to full peacetime health.
And the mechanics of that failure are deeply tied to the death by success we discussed earlier. The fact that war mobilization was required to empty that 1943 office is the ultimate historical proof that domestic work relief failed to fix the economy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to explain why it failed.
Right. I want to ask you to consider the scale here. Why did building tanks stimulate the economy in a way that building schools did not?
It comes down to the mechanics of deficit spending and the Keynesian multiplier effect.
Break that down for us.
The WPA was continually hamstrung by a political and fiscal conservatism that seems contradictory to the era. Roosevelt himself was, at his core, somewhat fiscally conservative.
People forget that about FDR.
They do. He was deeply uncomfortable with massive, unconstrained deficits. In 1937, feeling the economy was stabilizing, he actually slashed federal spending to try and balance the budget.
Which triggered the brutal Roosevelt recession, wiping out years of modest gains.
Exactly. The WPA was never authorized to inject enough capital into the economy to close the massive gap between what the country was producing and what it was capable of producing.
I look at the fiscal data, and the scale really is the entire story. At its height, the WPA might spend $1.5 to $2 billion a year.
Which felt astronomically huge to a 1930s politician.
Oh, sure. But macroeconomic reality doesn't care about political feelings. It was a half measure.
A drop in the bucket.
Because when World War II arrived, the federal government essentially abandoned all concern for the deficit. They began spending on something on the order of $80 billion a year.
They built entire industries from scratch.
The sheer, unconstrained, overwhelming volume of military expenditure flooded the economy with capital.
Which created a labor shortage that forced wages up and decisively broke the back of the Depression.
So the WPA was basically a holding action. It triaged the patient, kept the heart beating, and prevented total societal collapse.
But it did not administer the cure.
The overwhelming causal judgment of history points to the wartime command economy as the engine of recovery. Therefore, on the specific objective of macroeconomic recovery, the ledger must record a failure.
Agreed. A failure.
So we have a partial success on relief and a failure on recovery. But the WPA wasn't just an economic theory, it was a construction company.
And an arts patron.
Right. Let's move to the third column, infrastructure and culture. If the economic effects were temporary or insufficient, what about the physical residue?
Well, this is where the narrative shifts from qualified failures to unequivocal compounding triumph.
This is the good part.
The physical legacy left behind by those 8.5 million workers is almost difficult to mentally map because it is so vast.
The hard data is just astonishing. Let's look at roads. WPA labor built or improved over 650,000 miles of roads.
That is enough asphalt and graded dirt to wrap around the earth roughly 26 times.
26 times. And we aren't just talking about major highways. We are talking about crucial farm-to-market roads.
Right, roads that finally connected isolated rural agricultural communities to the national supply chain.
Which fundamentally altered rural economics.
Beyond the roads, they constructed over 78,000 new bridges and viaducts. They essentially laid the foundation for modern commercial aviation by building or improving hundreds of airports and landing fields, including LaGuardia in New York.
And the architectural legacy includes tens of thousands of public buildings, courthouses, post offices, hospitals, recreational facilities, and schools.
But we have to explain the mechanism of how this was built, because it wasn't just the federal government imposing architecture on local towns.
Right, they used a sponsor mechanism. The federal government didn't buy the concrete.
Exactly. If a town wanted a new high school, the local mayor or school board had to pitch the project and use local tax dollars to buy the materials.
The bricks, the glass, the steel.
The WPA merely supplied the labor, paying the wages of the unemployed men who built it.
This 7-5-25 split meant that every project was deeply integrated into the specific desires and financial commitments of the local community.
It prevented the building of federal white elephants that nobody wanted.
And that localized integration extends seamlessly into the cultural legacy, which operated under Federal Project Number 1.
Federal 1 was the umbrella for all the arts initiatives. The Federal Art Project, the Music Project, the Theater Project, and the Writers Project.
I really want to focus on the Writers Project specifically, because its contribution is staggering.
It really is.
The WPA hired unemployed white-collar workers, teachers, journalists, librarians, and sent them out to document the country.
They created the American Guide series, producing incredibly detailed, localized historical and cultural guidebooks for every single state.
But more profoundly, they recognized that an entire generation of Americans who had been born into slavery before the Civil War were rapidly dying of old age in the 1930s.
Such a crucial realization.
The WPA sent writers out to conduct thousands of oral history interviews, capturing the first-person narratives of formerly enslaved people before those voices were lost to time forever.
It is an irreplaceable historical archive.
It truly is. And whether we are talking about an invaluable slave narrative archive, a post office mural in rural Texas, or a high school gymnasium in Ohio, the way we must evaluate this column is through the economic concept of the dividend.
The infinite dividend. Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Okay, lay it out for us.
A physical or cultural project is an investment. The federal government, in conjunction with that local sponsor, made a single capital outlay in, say, 1938.
They paid for the bricks and the labor once.
But that asset has generated immense civic and economic value every single day since the mortar dried.
Right. A farm-to-market road built in 1939 allowed a farmer to sell his crops in 1940.
But that exact same road allowed a school bus to safely transport children in 1960. It allowed a commuter to drive to a tech job in 1995.
The return on that initial 1938 investment is functionally infinite because it compounds through generational use.
That is the most tangible takeaway of this entire deep dive.
You, the person listening to us right now, likely interact with WPA infrastructure constantly without ever registering the origin.
You might drop your kids off at a school built by relief labor, or hike a trail in a state park graded by the CCC and WPA.
Or walk through an airport terminal whose first runway was paved by men earning a security wage.
The infrastructure program is defended by hard, physical utility, completely insulated from historical nostalgia.
So on the third column of our ledger, the WPA scores a massive, undeniable success.
So the ledger is scored. Relief was a partial success bounded by fiscal timidity. Recovery was a failure superseded by war. Infrastructure was a compounding triumph.
So when the Division for Liquidation finally turned the lights out and locked the doors in June 1944, we have to ask, what was permanently lost to history and what managed to survive the liquidation?
Let's address the loss first, because it represents a massive shift in state capacity.
Right, what died with the WPA?
When the WPA was packed into the National Archives, the United States entirely lost a standing, mobilized civilian capability.
For 8 years, the federal government possessed the immediate bureaucratic machinery to deploy immense amounts of labor for the public good.
If a municipality identified a critical need, say, a massive flood required new levees, the mechanism existed to instantly fund the design and directly hire the local unemployed to build it.
And the modern contrast is stark.
The United States has never rebuilt a standing civilian labor capacity at that scale.
Today, if the government wants to build infrastructure, it operates entirely through complex layers of private contracting, grant-making, and public-private partnerships.
We fund the project, but we do not directly employ the labor force as an instrument of social policy.
When the WPA died, the government's ability to act as a nimble direct builder died with it.
But the survival of the program goes far beyond the physical concrete. What survived the liquidation was a profound philosophical precedent.
So what does this all mean for us today?
Well, before 1935, the concept of the federal government acting as the employer of last resort, directly hiring millions of citizens simply because the private market failed them, was largely considered radical.
Dangerous even, or overtly socialist by the mainstream political establishment.
Exactly. But the WPA dragged that concept out of the realm of radical theory and proved it as a workable historical fact.
It permanently shifted the boundary of what the American public believes their government is capable of executing during an existential crisis.
If you look at modern economic policy debates, whether it is a response to a massive recession, discussions around a Green New Deal, or proposals for a universal federal jobs guarantee,
The intellectual foundation of those arguments rests entirely on the precedent set by the WPA.
even modern critics who argue against those policies have to contend with the historical reality that direct federal employment actually functioned, at least in terms of logistical execution and physical output. The WPA proved the state can do it.
And it preserved the integrity of that precedent specifically because it died by success.
By emptying out those offices organically in 1943, the WPA avoided the slow, corrupt decay that destroys the legacy of so many well-intentioned bureaucracies.
It secured Roosevelt's honorable discharge.
It left behind a clean corpse, a meticulously organized archive for historians to study, and a physical foundation that continues to hold up the modern American economy.
The death of the WPA by macroeconomic success is exactly what cemented its historical victory.
It forces us to view the end of a program not always as a failure of policy, but sometimes as the ultimate, albeit ironic, fulfillment of its purpose.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we close this out. We started by walking you into that quiet, emptied office in 1943. We've scored the ledgers, debated the economics, and analyzed the bureaucratic demise.
But the legacy of that massive experiment is still vibrating underneath the asphalt of our modern world.
90 years on, we are still driving on their roads, we are still studying the histories they recorded, and we are still drawing down on that infinite compounding dividend every single day.
We really are.
But when you look at the complexities of the modern era, the environmental reviews, the fractured supply chains, the deep, bitter political polarization, and the loss of that standing state capacity,
It's a very different world now.
here is the lingering question you have to ask yourself. Could we ever build it again? Could we ever resurrect that fragile, massive capability that was packed into cardboard boxes in June 1944?
It's a heavy question.
It is something to seriously consider the next time you drive over a bridge you've never truly looked at before.